You made it work?
The recording.
Guys, I think we're gonna get started.
What? We're gonna get started?
Yeah, I think we're gonna get started. Yeah, so everyone, there's one more seat here, and I think we can put another tuchus here. And yeah, just get comfortable as much as possible. So thank you everyone for coming. Welcome to my house. And it's cool that you all came. And a special thank you to my murmur, my grandma, and my morfar, my grandpa, who just celebrated his 94th birthday. And Murmur, who's a youngster of 91, is gonna tell us a little bit about her story and the story of the family. And I remember when you came to my elementary school, and I think then you did it in Swedish, and I was translating, and
Right.
I probably did it mostly because I got a kick out of translating Swedish and showing everyone off that I can speak Swedish. So thank you for doing it again for my friend. Can everyone see the pictures? So, yes. So these are pictures that have been repainted, right? Fairly, you probably know that they're colored. Yeah. So the original didn't have color, but now we get to feel it a little more vividly. Yeah, I threw some tissues around the room because I'm a crybaby. So you can feel free. And exactly. I don't know.
What's this?
Preparing. Yeah, and I think we can start.
Yes, please.
Yes, and if you're cold, tell us and we'll turn it off. If you're cold, we can turn off the air conditioner.
There is a sound.
Yes, the sound I think is okay.
It's okay.
We can hear you. Yeah.
So my voice, please come and sit down. Okay. So as you understand, this is not the first time I'm talking about my experiences during the war, but each time is very different. And the big difference is between the audience. So, for instance, tomorrow I am going to Yad Vashem, and I will be talking to some very young students from Australia and South Africa. And I have to think before I start, who are the people listening? Because it happened in the beginning that I talked about quite terrible things to two young people, and that was not very good for them. I understood afterwards. But all of us are grown-ups and more and so. And I will start telling you a little bit about my background. And as you understand, these are my parents. And I was very, very lucky to be born to a couple of very clever and loving and wonderful, tolerant, and altogether beloved people. I had one sister, Miriam. She was 9 years older than I. And as it was such a big difference in age, I was looking up to her when I was little. I wanted to imitate everything she was doing. And most of the time I did not succeed. Talking about my childhood, I was really a lucky one. We were in a very good economical situation. So my family could afford to travel to different places in Europe. And we had help at home, of course. My mother didn't need to do anything practical. And Elżbieta, the woman who was staying with us, was like a member of our family. We liked each other very much. She was a completely uneducated person coming from a countryside, and she couldn't, it was very usual by that time, she couldn't read at all. And my sister Miriam and Elizabeth decided that my sister would teach her how to read and write. I don't remember this, but I heard afterwards that it took the two of them about 1 year to achieve something so unexpected. And my parents had no idea about what was happening. And when the day came, they revealed the secret. They came to the bedroom as usual on the Sunday morning to say good morning. And then Elizabeth had a paper or something, and she could read. And that was so emotional, so wonderful. My parents just couldn't believe it. So it was one of the achievements of my sister, and it had only one minus. And that was that Elżbieta was very religious. She was a Catholic, very religious person, and she spent more or less every whole Sunday in the church. And now she could read, and she came back from the church, which I still remember because I always saw it afterwards, the piles of uh, some stories from the church, and they were all of them extremely anti-Semitic. So that was a bad thing because poor Elizabeth didn't know what to do. She loved us. She had never, she could never think uh, about anything bad coming from our family. But the church was something she was very devoted to, and she didn't really know her position. She had to find it by herself. This was still a few years before the outbreak of the Second World War. And I had a wonderful time. The main reason for my happiness was that I was allowed to have a lot of animals at home. So I had a dog, a big dog.
Where is the dog?
No,
There it
this,
is.
yes. And he was a very close friend of mine. And besides, I had aquarium, I had Canary birds, and as none of us in our family wanted to have anything closed in, the cage of the canaries was always open, so they could fly around, and they came on to the cage just to have some meal. And this was very unusual, not very convenient for Elizabeth because she had to clean what they left around. But I think it was quite typical of this mentality of my parents. Nothing closed in, freedom. And the other thing which made me very happy was music. My parents came from two very, very different kind of backgrounds. My father came from a wealthy, I would say, rich family of Hasidim. I don't know if everybody knows. Hasidim is a very religious part of Jewish, how do you say, Jewish religion. Yes. But they were open-minded. They loved to read and to travel, and they were, as I said, very well off. My mother came from a secular family of Bohemian people. The many members of her family were musicians. My mother was pianist. One of her brothers was quite well-known pianist as well, of much higher level than my mother. But she went to conservatorium because she had, it was paid. Scholarship, thank you. And this family of my mother's were always very poor. They had never any money. So to imagine that these two so different people met and they fell in love and they married and they had a wonderful, good and long marriage. Not talking about what they had to go through during the war, but the marriage was wonderful. I had only one little problem in my life when I was little. I didn't like to eat. And I remember several doctors coming to my home, and they tried to discover what was the reason of this big problem. And I don't remember any of them, only one, and his name was Dr. Janusz Korczak. I don't know if he is familiar to any of you. He he was, and he is a very, very famous, not only doctor, but educator. And he made new laws for the children. Do you know about him? You do, yes. And I remember when he started to come to our place, he was not there many times, but the first time he came, I fell in love with him. He was so funny, and he never talked about my problem. He talked about the books of his children's books, which we had at home, and theater pieces, which I saw, and a lot of funny things. And he was so full of joy. And he told my mother that he's quite sure that the moment there would be no food, I would be the first one to ask, please give me something to eat. And he was absolutely right. He told my mother that he thinks that the only problem with this young lady is that she is very spoiled. And my mother was not very happy at all. I remember some incidents which were an illustration to a problem my parents and other grown-ups were talking about. This was called anti-Semitism. Of course, I had no idea what anti-Semitism was at all. I was too small. And that was something which was very, very disturbing to my family. I started school, for instance, when I was 7 years old. And I remember coming to my classroom just in the beginning of the term and opening my desk. And inside there was a piece of paper and I couldn't read it. So I took this piece of paper with me home and showed it to my mother and father. And they were, well, extremely unhappy because it was a kind of a bad poem. And it says something about the nature and ended saying, go back to your Palestine, bloody Jew. And my mother was desperate. She took the piece of paper with her to school, to the schoolmaster, and asked him, can you read it, please? And what do you say? And this was a non-Jewish school. And the headmaster of the school was, of course, not Jewish either. And he read it, and he said, it's not my business, and it's no problem. I'm not going to deal with it. It must have been some naughty child who put this note into your daughter's desk. So my mother was extremely disappointed with this lack of reaction. And she told me that now it's too late, but I promise that next year, when you will start your second class, it will be a Jewish school and you will not have this kind of problem. By the way, it never happened because this was the year the war started. So there was no school anymore. I remember some other anti-Semitic incidents in my young life. For instance, my mother took me to a dressmaker several times every year. There were no shops for children, only for grown-ups. So either you had to do it yourself if you could, or otherwise you had to have a person who could make it for you. So I went with my mother, and I hated very much this visits, because on the wall there was a big picture of Jesus Christ on the cross. And Jesus was a handsome, young, blonde, blue-eyed man suffering. And he looked at me, and of course, I felt pity with him. And once the dressmaker said, "The Jews has crucified our God, Jesus Christ." And this time, my mother just wouldn't tolerate it. She paid for the dress, and we never went to this dressmaker again. And these were some of the incidents in my life which I remember, which made my parents go for a checking to Palestine. They went together with two other members of the family, and they were away a long time. And then when they came back, they were full of enthusiasm. They told us about the good atmosphere in the country, the nature. They took with them a lot of exotical fruits and presents, and they were very happy. And they told us about the meeting between my father and his much younger brother, whom they met in Palestine. This brother belonged to many thousands of young people from all over Europe who went to Palestine to make the country more up to date and convenient. And all of them were working extremely hard. And Srulek, my father's youngest brother, achieved one thing: malaria. And he kept it for the rest of his life. But all these young people were working, and when my parents told Miriam and myself about their impressions, they said that the country was extremely primitive. There were almost no towns, and the communication between the cities were more or less not existing. And everything was so primitive that they didn't think it was time for us to move and settle down in Palestine. Let's wait a couple of years, and we'll do it when everything will come in a better state. And this was a decision they regretted all their life. I remember all the grown-ups talking about Hitler and anti-Semitism, and they were often talking about a possibility of another world war starting. And I didn't know anything about such things, of course. But all of a sudden, the war started. Poland was the first country in Europe occupied. Only after 3 weeks of fighting, the war was over, and Poland had to give up. Of course, it was a very small, a country which couldn't compete with the great German army. And we saw the first German soldiers and officers on our street. That was scary enough, but we were still living in our beautiful apartment. But every day there were big affiche posters around us in Warsaw on the walls, telling people about the new laws, and especially what would happen to people who did not want to obey the new laws. And as I had already the.
But she can't be here.
Oh, I see. I could already read. And I saw something which puzzled me. And I asked my parents, can you please tell me why is there a difference between the laws for Jewish people and for non-Jewish people? What have we done? What do they accuse us of? What, are we worse than the others? How come? And my father tried to calm me down, and he said, this is too big discussion. You are too little, and you are too, you've got too small brains to understand such a big issue. But I promise when you would grow up a bit more and get more clever, I'll come back to you and we'll talk about it. And when I think of this moment, more than 80 years has passed since then. And I still don't know the difference. I still don't know the difference, the reason for so much hate against the Jewish people, against other minorities as well. But I'm talking about something which I know better than other issues. And I'm talking about the hatred towards Jewish people, and I still don't have the answer because there is no answer. There were among the new laws was one which struck me personally more than others. That was a law forbidding Jewish people to be together with animals, to take care of animals. So I had to give away all my dog and all the other animals because the German law said that animals are superior to Jews, and that was not allowed to mix. And that was a terrible tragedy in my life because this was something I grew up with and loved. I remember grown-ups were talking about a place which would be called ghetto. And we didn't know what ghetto was, but it was a place which was now surrounded by high walls. And on the top of the walls, there was barbed wire, and there were some gates to ghetto, and they were watched by German soldiers. And it looked very scary. And then there came announcements that within a couple of weeks, all the Jewish people from Warsaw would be transported into ghetto. And that was not a question of if people wanted to be transported into ghetto or not. It was a must, as usual. From the beginning of the war, there was never any option for any Jewish person. We had to obey every law, every word the Germans told us to do. So I remember, well, I have to tell you about the last day in our my beautiful home, apartment. Two German soldiers or officers came to our place, and they had with them a lot of stamps and ribbons. And in the previous announcements, we were told that when we are transferred to ghetto, we will be able to take with us only some basic things like a bed, some utensils for a bed, some kitchen utensils, very little clothes, and that's all. All the rest, everything else, would be confiscated, and from that moment on will belong to Germany. And for my father, it was a terrible blow because he was an owner of a proud owner of a beautiful big library consisting of books in different languages. The languages he knew so well: Polish, Yiddish, Russian, and German. Many books which he collected during his traveling in Europe. And every time he came from such a trip, he was very proud to show the family some new excellent first edition or antiquity or something, and he was so happy about it. And now there were stamps all over. The library was not his anymore. And for my mother, that was, as she was a pianist, it was her piano. And we still don't know how it happened, but my mother asked in her beautiful, elegant German, she asked the two men, "Can I please take with me the piano?" And they talked to each other. They were very confused. They talked to each other. And after a while, they said, "Okay." which was something we could never understand. But the piano came with us, with some beds and some other things, everything else in our apartment. And it was a lot of beautiful furniture and good art and how do you say, matto?
Carpets.
Yes, on the floors, and all kind of beautiful things. Everything was confiscated. And the only thing which was extra, which was impossible to explain why they allowed us, was the piano. And this was a very silly, quite idiotic thing to do, because who would need a piano in ghetto? Well, we didn't know how it would be. And the piano went with us, and we were placed in my grandparents' apartment, because this apartment was placed in the Jewish part of Warsaw, contrary to my mother's side, which was quite far away from it. But now we were in my grandparents' apartment. I knew it very well from before the war. I've been there hundreds of times, spending all the high holidays together with them. But now we were 40 people in this apartment. By the way, my grandparents owned the house, the whole house they were living in, and all the houses around. The whole quarter belonged to my grandparents. It was impossible to imagine what happened when this number of Jewish people were transported into ghetto. It was a great number, 350,000 Jewish people. 350,000 people were now in ghetto. Afterwards, we heard that some of the Jewish people who were supposed to be transferred never came in because they found a hiding place, some other place, and they were hiding during the whole war. But there were quite not so many people, but they succeeded in not being in the ghetto. From the very first day, it was an absolute hell on the earth. And I could never understand what was happening and why it was happening. And what was incredible was that everybody who entered ghetto was only a number. He or she did not have any past, any occupation, any success. It was independent on if a person was a shoemaker or a philosopher or a dancer or a doctor. It made no difference. The person was just a slave in ghetto without any past. And I saw from our windows many small children on the street. They had lost their parents. They had lost their siblings. They had no place to go. They slept on the street. They had no one to take care of them. And these children had nothing to eat. They didn't have anyone to care of them. And they begged. They were dancing and singing a little bit. And they tried to get some piece of bread or some vegetable from people passing by. They had nothing, and they went sick. And we saw it day by day, that many of the children in our part of the street, they were sick and they were dying and they died. And they were lying on the streets. And I just couldn't understand. As usual, I was asking my parents a lot of silly questions. I remember asking them, why is there no one from the outside, no other country which comes and helps us? Why is there no one who cares what's happening to us? How is it possible? And as usual, they said, please, we've got so much to think of. Don't ask. There is no answer to your questions. No, there is no one. Very soon, the streets were full of bodies of grown-up people as well. And they were lying on the street. In the beginning, some people tried to put some newspaper or something over the bodies, but there were so many that it was impossible. And then they came some Jewish slaves, which had the terrible work to do, and that was to come with their carriages to collect all the dead people. And I remember seeing them taking dead bodies by their legs and their arms and throwing them on the carriages and taking them away to some place, I don't know where. Of course, it was terribly dirty, incredibly dirty in all the place. And with dirt came epidemical diseases. And among all the terrible epidemic diseases, there was one called typhus. And this was killing people every day. Every day, many, many people died of typhus. And my very lovely grandmother, my mother's mother, was one of the first victims. She died of typhus, and again, when we heard this terrible news, we went to her place to say goodbye. And I was terrified and so disappointed. And I told my parents, how could you allow it? Why didn't you help my grandmother? Why didn't you take a good doctor? Why didn't you give her medication? Why didn't you take her to a hospital. How could you allow her to die? And my parents cried, and this did make them less unhappy. And this is one of the many silly things I have done in my life, which I never could forgive myself. In the beginning of ghetto, there were still, in spite of what was happening, there were some energetic and clever people, and my father and my sister belonged to these groups of people who were working so hard. They tried to give some uh, uh, possibility for people to feel some humanity, some culture. And they were arranging theater performances by professional actors, some concerts by professional musicians. There were many, many, many of them. And I remember the chamber music played in our home. And I loved this so much. I didn't like the chamber music, but I liked the happenings, the different instruments, and I had a strong memory of this. And now my father was trying to, together with many of his friends, to keep it alive for a while. Other people were organizing small groups of students, of pupils, school children, and a teacher. This was, of course, not allowed. It was not allowed for Jewish people to get any kind of education. This was not allowed for Jew to be educated because it was not needed. But these groups existed quite a long time. And of course, my parents put me in some of these groups so I wouldn't be, they said, too much behind when the war was over. And I learned a lot because the groups and the teachers were so intensive, and we even got some homework, but it's not always, of course, very seldom possible to make some homework because terrible things were happening to us all the time. There were some small factories, very effective in the ghetto of Warsaw, and as we heard afterwards, in the other places as well. And there were people who were producing different things, Jewish slaves who were there working terribly hard from the early in the morning to late in the evening. They were employed, but without payment, of course. They had some extra delivery of food, and they had each of them a piece of paper telling that he or she should be alive, left alive, because this person was needed for producing things for Germany. So this was a very valuable position, and everybody wanted, but very few people had this possibility, and it didn't last very long. And I remember my father and some of his brothers working in a factory producing möbler, vad heter det? Furniture, and even coffins for the soldiers who would be killed, German soldiers. And in another factory, the women were working, producing shoes and boots and uniforms and clothes. And all these things produced there were transported, shipped to Germany during the biggest part of the war, which was a fantastic, genius, wonderful, clever idea to have things produced free of charge by experts and delivered home to Germany. Very, very often there were selections. And then we were told to come down to the street immediately. Everything should be done immediately. So we had to run down the steps and stand, usually 4 and 4 people. And then the Germans came and took people to a place in ghetto. And this place was called Umschlagsplatz. And this place was a train station. The trains were leaving from that place to different camps. And of course, no one wanted to go by any of these trains. And no one was asked if he or she wanted to go. For this reason, in all the apartments we lived in ghetto, the first thing the grown-ups made was some hiding places where the people who would not take part in selection because they were too old or too sick or too little, they were hidden while the others went down. And so we were hidden, and now I remember I did not show you the photograph of my family just before the war. Here is my family. Yes. So the man second one from the left is my father, and my mother is the lady in white dress. Yes, and this is Miriam, my sister. No, this is Miriam, right?
She looks like me.
Yes, and in the front they are my grandparents, right? And to the left is myself, and the rest are siblings of my father and their spouses. So most of us, not exactly all of us, but most of us from this picture were now in this apartment. And we tried, of course, to avoid being sent by the trains to concentration.
Do you know about where the friends went? Do you know where those friends?
If we knew,
Yeah.
we suspected that this was a place which was, if possible, still more terrible than ghetto. But the Germans wanted to make, they had one goal. From the beginning of Hitler, there was one goal for Germany, and that was to kill, to murder all the Jews of Europe. That was the holy goal. And it was done in an excellent, sophisticated, well-organized way. And the Germans wanted to do this work and not to be disturbed by any kind of revolution or people with weapons. They wanted to work in a good and organized way. And quite often we had to run down to the street and to listen to one of the officers who were telling us that there was no reason to be afraid of going to the camps, because the camps were camps for work, for people of all kinds. There was work for people who were young and strong and knew something. There was the kindergarten for small kids, and there were schools, and there were hospitals for people who needed to be treated, and we should absolutely not be afraid. And I remember one special occasion when I happened to stand very close to a place quite high up, and on the top of this pedestal, there was a German officer standing, holding his hand on the head of a little blonde boy. And the man who talked said that, listen, everybody, don't be afraid. I swear on the hands of my son, I'm holding my hand on his head, and I swear to you, nothing bad is going to happen to you when you go to the camps. You will have to work, but you will be taken well care of, so don't be afraid. And when this meeting came to an end, it took only a little while when we heard that this little boy was not his son. It was a little Jewish boy. He happened to be blonde and blue-eyed, and he was shot. So we never had any confidence in what the Germans were telling us. But what made it still more sure was a group of young people around the 20s, 18 to 25. You can find their names in Yad Vashem. They were taken from Warsaw Ghetto to one of the camps, together with their parents and their siblings. And the parents and the siblings, the smaller siblings, were killed at the arrival. And these young people were working. They were strong and they were working in this camp. And they decided that they must try to go back to the ghetto from where they were taken and give information. So quite a big group of these people escaped from the camp. Not all of them made it. Some of them were shot on the way back, but some of them could make their way into ghetto, and they spread and talked to as many people as they could reach and told them that you must not believe anything you hear from the Germans. These places are death factories. They are only there to kill people, to do nothing else. So don't believe one word of what the Germans are trying to assure you about. And this made the atmosphere in ghetto still worse, if possible. At one of the big meetings where they sold, they took people against their will to the trains or let some be left in ghetto. I don't know why, but my parents decided that the four of us, my parents, Miriam and myself, would participate. And the rest, we were hiding in the house, in the apartment. So we went there, and it was a terrible, terrible experience because we had to proceed. It was a very hot day, and we were not allowed to take with us anything to drink or to eat. And we were proceeding slowly towards the end of this long, long street. At the end of the street, there were two soldiers, two officers, Germans, looking at the people in front of them when they came close. And they had to decide immediately to the right, which would mean that these people could stay a bit more in ghetto, or to the left, Umschlagsplatz and the trains. And we knew that our chances were very, very small because my parents were by that time already in a very, very bad physical shape. And I was a little nothing. And my sister Miriam was still looking quite normal. And then my father and one of the officers looked at each other, and they discovered that they were friends. They were personal friends from before the war. They were business friends. They had been traveling together in Europe many times, and they have been working together and visiting each other's family. My father in Hamburg, and this man in Warsaw for a dinner. And this man had 1 second to decide what to say, and he shouted to the right, and he saved us. Again, I mean, it happened just by chance, but many times that we happened to make it, to survive a situation which seemed to be completely impossible. And after the war, I remember so well, one of the first things my father started to do was looking for this man in Hamburg. And it took a long, long time because nothing was functioning after the war. The phones, the telephones, telegrams, nothing was functioning well. And then we got the answer that all the family of this man were killed in Hamburg during the bomb pouring from the American plants, I suppose. It was war, so they were killed. And that was a source for sorrow for all of us, especially for my father. When we came back to our apartment this day, we discovered that the Germans were there and the place was empty. No one was there. My grandparents, my uncles, my small cousins, everybody was taken to one of the trains, and that's it. We never saw them again. We were still, I can't tell you what happened to my parents when we discovered all this. All four of us were completely out of our mind. We lost our family. And now it seems that everything was without any meaning, in vain. But we went on a bit, and we still had to go through terrible things in ghetto. There were soldiers who really, well, there were soldiers, German soldiers, I'm sure, who did not like to do what they were told. They were absolutely against it, but they had no chance to make a protest, to say no, because the moment they said so, they were executed immediately. So there was no chance. But there were many, many more other soldiers who enjoyed what they were doing because they thought just like Hitler did, that this was a good thing to do, to get rid of the Jews. And one of these persons had a nickname. His nickname was Frankenstein. And Frankenstein was not quite mentally normal. He was usually walking around and singing a bit for himself. And he had one hobby, and that hobby was to kill small children. It made him very happy, and he enjoyed it. And we all knew so well that the moment Frankenstein and a little boy or girl would meet face to face, that would be the last moment of this child's life. But it happened once that I was on the street. I don't know what I would fetch around someplace in the neighborhood. And all of a sudden, Frankenstein was there. And he stopped me. He smiled. He was in a very good mood. And I knew that he would kill me. And he pulled up his revolver. And it was straight on my face. And he said, "You turn around and go back to your door. Slowly, slowly." And I did. I turned around. I knew that I would be dead. And I came inside the door. Our neighbors were watching and told my parents afterwards what happened. And I came into the house and I fainted. I often fainted by that time because I had no food enough. And my parents were told by the neighbors that Frankenstein went a few steps more and he saw another little girl and he shot her. And there is no answer why she and not I. My parents and Miriam decided that we must leave ghetto. It became absolutely impossible to continue to try to survive. And that was the only goal of all of us there, to survive to the next day. But there was and we had a possibility, and that was to bribe one of the men who was watching one of the doors. And sometimes it was all right. He turned his head away, and let people pass by at his back. But sometimes, and it happened often, he took the money and then he shot the people. But we succeeded. It was only that we had a note from my mother's sister and her little family who were in hiding on the so-called Aryan side. And there was only room for 2 people. not for 4. And we had to decide who would go and who would stay. And the grown-ups decided that mother and I should go, as there was only place for 2 people. And my father and Mira would stay. And this happened just a few days before the uprising of Warsaw Ghetto. And this decision was, I don't know if it was right or wrong. It was terrible because we had to divide our family, not knowing if we would meet again. So mother and I went out. And it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. We went to one place we knew where a good girlfriend of Miriam's lived and still lived. And only the father was at home. And he was such a nice man, but he was terribly, terribly afraid. And he said he cannot risk his life and his family's life because there was a life penalty for keeping or helping a Jew. So he said, no, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And he was crying. He was such a lovely man. So we went to another place, and that was in the same house where we lived before the war. And this family said they were terribly afraid that we might stay overnight before we come to the place where there was room for us. For some reason, it was too far away. I don't know why we didn't go directly. So we stayed there, and the next day we came to the Destiny, and it was wonderful to see my auntie and her husband and little daughter. And on the other hand, it was terrible because we didn't know if we would see the rest of the family again. And after a few days, the uprising in ghetto started. And it was absolutely terrifying. We saw red skies around the clock, night and day, night and day, night and day. It was black and red, and mother was terribly depressed. And some days later, my father and Miriam came. That was one of the greatest wonders in our life. They could escape. It was there were only one more lorry carrying taking out food from ghetto. There was a lot of food for all the German soldiers in ghetto. And on one of the lorries, there were people hidden. And my father and Miriam succeeded in going in one of the lorries, and they came to us. That was absolutely wonderful. But we didn't know about our life in hiding, and we didn't know how long time it would take. And life in hiding was absolutely unhuman. In a way, it was still more unhuman than being in Warsaw Ghetto. We had no rights, no human rights, how to live. We had to be extremely careful not to show anyone of the neighbors or people outside that there were people in hiding. So we were never allowed to come close to the window, or we were never allowed to talk. We only whispered. And not make, we were not allowed to make any kind of sound, like wearing shoes. And besides, we did not or light a lamp. And we were completely dependent on the people who now gave us possibility to hide. But we were hiding in several very different places. Some of the people were human and tried to help us, and some were not decent at all, very unhuman. All of the people who gave Jews a possibility to hide, all of them were paid. Everybody was paid by underground organizations and some American organizations. I really don't know. But we didn't have much money left, and we were besides not allowed to pay for our stay. And we didn't know how long time this terrible, unhuman life would go on. And it went on for 2 more years. I can't tell you much because otherwise I would sit here and talk for another day, night and day, or a week, or a month. There are so many stories. Some of the stories I don't tell. Some of the stories I tell only to people who are grown up, as I told you. It's impossible to cover whatever we went through, even if I would be talking for the rest of my life. We were liberated by Russian army. And of course, we were glad that the war was over and the Germans were away. But the Russians, many of them were absolutely unhuman. They were uncivilized, they were wild, they were wild people. They came from, many of them, from very, very far away, in the east, not from big big places, big towns, but from faraway places. And they, for instance, they wanted to rape all the women because they thought that this would be okay because they liberated us. So that would be a reward for what they did for us. And it's another wonderful thing that one of the Russian quite high officer, Lonya, when he came to our place, he fell madly in love with my daughter, my sister, Miriam. And he said he is going to protect us. And he told all his men that they were absolutely forbidden to do anything, any bad thing to our family. He is protecting us. We are very important. And he is going to marry the daughter of the family. Of course, she had no intention to marry him, but he was a wonderful, very gentle and nice man. And he protected us. And he gave us possibility to leave Warsaw, because now we live in a half ruined place in Warsaw. Many other survivors lived there together with us. But it was very unhuman. There were, of course, no beds. It was absolutely terrible. We went to see our old place, our old apartment, and it was gone. And the house was gone, and the street was gone, and the whole part of the town was gone. So we came and lived quite a long time because there were no other option. And my parents were more and more ill. And yes, one thing I want to tell you, which is so wonderful. They sent me once to fetch some paper, some document or something, a very short distance from where we lived. And I had to promise that I wouldn't go some other place or get lost or something. And the moment I came out, I saw, after a few steps, I saw a young person, a very thin, terribly dirty young man in uniform. And I knew that, that I know him, so I forgot all the promises I gave to my parents, and I ran after him. And then I pulled his sleeve, and he looked down at me and cried out my name and took me up, and that was the youngest brother of my mother. And we were quite sure that he was already killed because he was fighting somewhere in Russia during the war. So I didn't come with this piece of paper. I came with my uncle. He was, by the way, I think 17 years younger. So he was I remembered him because he was so often in our home before the war. And my mother was so happy to see him. And he couldn't believe his eyes because she was the only one, I think, one of the few people who survived. It was like a mother for him. My parents were sick, and they decided that we cannot go to Palestine yet because they were in too bad shape. And we must go find some place where they could try to recover, to get back to some normal shape. And my father had a communication, I don't know how, I don't remember, I don't understand, with some of his Swedish business friends from before the war. It took a long time until they answered, but they did, and they said that they are willing to help. So the four of us came to Stockholm. It must have been after summer 1945, and I was now almost 14 years old. And they placed us in some kind of a big hotel or pension outside Stockholm. There were many other refugees, other survivors, and some Swedish normal people. And then my parents really started to get sick. They were sick all the time. My father had heart attacks. He was in hospital all the time. And my mother had surgery. She was in hospital. And in spite of all this, they decided for me that I must start going to school. And I really didn't like the idea. I was in opposition. I didn't want to learn anything. I didn't want to have any obligations. I just wanted to be a child and to run around, perhaps to have an animal. And they said no. And I was very angry with them. But after many years, I was extremely thankful and happy that they forced me to go to school. But the first year in school in Stockholm was terrible. I hated every minute. The other young people around me, my classmates, didn't understand who I was. They never asked. They couldn't ask in the beginning because, of course, I didn't know any Swedish. It took me 1 year to learn the language. And in the meantime, I tried to learn as much as I could. But my parents were not at home. a lot of time. That my sister Miriam left us very, very soon, very quickly. She didn't like Sweden at all. She didn't appreciate anything. She just wanted to come to Palestine. But to start with, she went to stay with some other survivors, her friends in London. And we heard that she met an Israeli man there who was visiting in London as well at the same time. And they decided to get married. And they came to the big synagogue to us, of course, but they were married in the big synagogue of Stockholm. And Miriam was the first member of our family who settled down in Tel Aviv. And it took some time. That was around the time when Israel was established. They settled down in Tel Aviv. And it took a few years for us to live in that place, in this pension. And I was quite unhappy. But I really tried to do my best in learning. But I was crying most of the time. So I remember every day I was sitting in the toilet in the school crying. And my wonderful, wonderful class teacher, Anna, came to sit with me. And she held me. We couldn't talk. I didn't know any other language, only Polish. And she was just sitting there, and she was giving me some private Swedish lessons. And obviously it helped. So she really saved me. She was a wonderful teacher and an excellent human being. It went year after year went by, and one day my father said that now we are feeling much better, and I have already tried and started to make some money, to make some business in his old branch, which was Trevaru.
Wooden.
Timber.
Wooden.
Timber, yes, branch. And he said, now it's time to go, to leave, and to go to Israel, which was just then established. But then I happened to have met a nice Jewish boy.
Oh, that's trouble with these Jewish boys.
And I said, I don't know what to do. If to go with you, I really didn't know. It was such a terrible, difficult decision to make. If to go with my wonderful, loving parents and to meet with my sister Miriam, or to get married to this man. but we decided to marry, and I think it was a good choice. he's still a very close friend of mine, my best friend. And I can tell you who are not belonging to the family that some months ago, the two of us were celebrating 70 years of marriage. And that's quite a lot. I think I'll stop here. If there are any questions, I will be very happy to answer. Thank you for listening.
How many people they had?
No, but my hearing is very, very... Så, Ella, då får du, om det blir något, får du översätta eller säga det. Yes.
After you and your mother escaped from the ghetto, you joined, you said your aunt. How many people were in hiding in the place that you went to?
And how many survived the whole hiding period?
There was 3 more people, but we were not in the same place because very often it happened that there was some suspicion from one of the neighbors. And, you know, of all the people who were in hiding, about 6% survived. 6% survived of all the people who were in hiding. The others were delivered to the closest police commissariat, and for each Jewish person you delivered, they gave you almost $1.
How did you
Jag hör inte.
Jo, det gör du. How did you escape the ghetto? Verade is asking. When you and your mother left, there was a guard that let you leave?
I told you. We bribed him, and we came out through one of the gates, and that's why we were only 2 because there was no room for the whole family to start with. Marie, är det någonting du vill veta?
Jag funderar,
Nej, men då får du skrika.
hur kunde ni överhuvudtaget muta den här vakten? Vad hade ni att muta honom med?
The question was, with what money could we bribe the person who was watching the door? I think that many people still have money. We couldn't.
Hidden. The money was hidden.
Yes. I mean, we were very well off before the war, and in ghetto, the money we spent was to bribe this, to bribe her, just to survive or to get some more carrots or something, or to get some medicine. We didn't have any needs. There were no shops. No one needed anything.
Maybe
Only
a gold
to survive.
or something like
Oh. Ilanit is asking about the Poles. I think you talked about the Germans a few times, but about the people from Poland, how they treated you before the war, during the war, after the war.
Have you got time to read that more?
And sometimes they speak about the foreign people.
I don't hear a thing at all. Tell.
Because sometimes we speak about the Polish people, person, I don't know, the honeymoon,
Yeah,
worse than the German.
yeah. I don't think you love the Polish people who you met.
Listen, I've met many wonderful Polish people,
For the
but most of the Polish people had nothing against what the Germans were doing. Many of them. I can't say any proportion. If it was 30, 70, whatever, I don't know. I know nothing about numbers. The numbers I know, I learned when I was grown up. I only have my emotions, my what I saw. But of course, during the hiding, we were afraid to be discovered by some neighbors who didn't like Jews and who might like very much to have $1 per person.
Have you been back to Poland?
Hmm?
Have you been back?
Yes, yes, yes. We've been back in Poland a couple of times.
Elizabeth, the woman.
Can Nomi tell?
We went together with.
If you talk louder,
Then your mother will be.
even I can hear.
I can talk very loudly. We went together with two cousins to see a little bit of where my mother comes from. It wasn't very comfortable. We, like what my mother said about their old apartment building, that entire part of Warsaw was completely bombed to the ground and there was absolutely nothing left. But it was reconstructed and it looks the same today. It was reconstructed from the original plans. But we went to see the house, which is not the original house. And it was quite clear that we were not welcome. They looked at us with great suspicion, and here the Jews come and they want something from us. And there was it was quite uncomfortable. There's a little bit left of the ghetto walls. There's nothing left from inside, from the original buildings from inside the ghetto. It was completely erased. There's a monument. There's a big statue. There's part of the wall that is still in existence. But they're pictures. They're the only way to get any kind of sense of what it was like is from photos, and there are a lot of photos. There are videos, there are photos, so you can.
By the way, when we went to Poland, there were two of us, and my sister Miriam's son. And who was there more? His wife, right. So that was very important for us, for me, to have part of my sister with me too. She's gone, of course. She was much older than I, so she's been gone many years.
אחרי שבעצם הופך לגטו, לא היה בדרך אנשים שיוכלו לחזור אותם או לעצור אותם או לעשות את זה. ויש בדרך עוד אנשים חיילים.
Do you remember after you escaped from the ghetto, if you were very worried to be caught on the way to hiding, if you were worried that someone would bring you back?
If if I may.
Sure.
When my mother and my grandmother left the ghetto, they were caught. And it was quite usual, at least the way we tell the story. It was on purpose. There would be poles outside the gates of the ghetto, not only in Warsaw, but in general, who were basically hunters. And they were looking for people like my mother and my grandmother who were trying to escape, and they were caught. And my grandmother, who was a very timid and sweet person, was told, and this goes in answer to your question also, that she needs to pay him or he will take them to the Gestapo. And my grandmother didn't have anything. She was left empty-handed with this skinny girl. And so he said, okay, so your wedding ring, which was the last thing that my grandmother still had, and she gave him the wedding ring. And this is my grandmother's wedding ring. Stubborn bought when he came to Sweden.
Thank you.
I think we're going to conclude for now so that people who have to go can go and people who need some carbs can get that. But
Just a moment.
yeah,
We are so many different kind of people here. I mean, of different origin. And I don't want to point at you, but I would be I'm so happy that the two of you are here. I'm especially thankful and happy, but I would like very much to hear some comments from you, any of you. If you can do it in a form of a question or whatever. This is important for me, thank you. But you have to shout. I'm glad.
I think for me, I'm very thankful that I have this opportunity today to be here. I mean, in Germany, thanks God, nowadays we are learning a lot about what happened. But to me, people who can tell the stories, it's I'm very glad that I had the chance to be here this evening. Thank you so much. And yeah, it's also a huge responsibility which came out, and especially seeing that Germany has still very huge problems with right-wing parties and so on. It is good to be reminded to fight against that, and it's thank you very much that we've learned about the story.
Thank you. Hast du etwas Neues gelernt?
Not about like the history beside it, because like what the story and the history which happened, but like the personal stories, which is always something new, and it's something you can't be taught through history books because it's like your story. So of course, a lot of new things.
How is this subject discussed in schools now? I don't know. You are a bit over 20.
Yeah.
Yes, both of you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So how was it in school? Did you have it on the weekly, how do you say, schema? Curriculum?
Yes, it is taught in schools, and I think it might start in history class.
No.
Sorry. Okay. It's taught first in history classes, for sure, like maybe in the 5th or 6th grade, I would say. Probably not before that. I don't know. It's not like real meetings or events where children would, or maybe children in puberty would start to realize what all of this is about are still a bit rare, I would say. I mean, you would know about the hard facts and about the war itself and about the Shoah you would learn, but I think it's very rare that people get to hear about like real stories of people. People need to invest themselves in wanting to know about it, to get to know about it. For example, I still said it's rare, but in my school there was a person who survived as well and who told about her story. Yeah, but those events are not that common, I would say.
But I mean, for example, we both had the chance during our time at school to visit Israel and learn here about the Shoah. So there are also a lot of programs where we, besides schools, just the normal curriculum where like other events happens to learn about history and to, yeah, that people see what happened.
So maybe to give an answer, it's part of the education, but still it's a fact that every fifth person in Germany can't really tell about what the Holocaust or the Shoah is. So it's still a lack of education in it and ongoing anti-Semitism that is taking place in our society.
What is your opinion about the anti-Semitism growing? How do we stop it?
More. I think we're gonna solve the world's problems just in a minute. If you have time to stay and keep having the conversation, I'd love to hear, but I know that some people are on the
You're
clock.
right.
So I'm staying. I live here. You guys can stay. So opens. You can hang out.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
All
for
of you.
doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're the Antiques of Things.
Okay.
Yeah. Right here. The things in different.